The morning sun barely broke through the thick London clouds as Kate stood by the large window of their private room in Kensington Palace. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the delicate teacup, watching the steam rise and disappear into the cool air. William sat across from her, his usually strong shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes fixed on a photograph that rested on the mahogany table between them. Neither of them had spoken for what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed since they received the news that would change everything. The palace walls, which had witnessed countless moments of joy and sorrow throughout history, now held within them a silence so profound that even the ticking of the antique grandfather clock seemed intrusive. Kate finally set down her cup, the soft clink against the saucer breaking the stillness. She walked slowly toward William, her silk dressing gown flowing behind her like a gentle wave. When she reached him, she placed her hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension that had built up overnight. William looked up at her, and in that moment, Kate saw something she had rarely witnessed in all their years together. His blue eyes, usually so composed and regal, were filled with a vulnerability that made her heart ache. He reached for her hand, holding it as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. They both knew what the coming days would bring. The scrutiny, the cameras, the endless questions from a world that watched their every move. But more than that, they knew they were about to face something deeply personal, something that would test the very foundation of who they were. The children were still asleep in their rooms down the hall, blissfully unaware of the storm that was quietly gathering. Kate thought of them, of George with his curious questions, Charlotte with her bright smile, and little Louis with his infectious laughter. How would they explain this to them? How could they help their children understand something that they themselves were struggling to comprehend? These thoughts swirled in Kate's mind as she sat down beside William, close enough that their knees touched. William finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The words came slowly, as if each one required tremendous effort. He talked about duty, about family, about the promises made long ago that now felt heavier than ever. Kate listened, her eyes never leaving his face, memorizing every expression, every pause, every breath. She had always been his anchor, the one person who could see past the title and the crown to the man beneath. Now, more than ever, he needed that strength. As the morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the ornate carpet, they began to talk about the practical matters that needed addressing. There were schedules to rearrange, appointments to cancel, and a delicate balance to maintain between their public duties and this intensely private moment. Kate pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen as she considered who to call first. But William gently took the device from her hands and set it aside. Not yet, he seemed to say without words. Let us have this moment before the world rushes in. They sat together on the sofa, Kate's head resting on William's shoulder, his arm wrapped protectively around her. Outside, the palace grounds were beginning to stir with the morning activities of the staff, but inside this room, time seemed to stand still. They talked about memories, about the early days when they were just two university students trying to navigate young love. They remembered the challenges they had faced, the times when the weight of expectations seemed too much to bear, and how they had always found their way back to each other. Kate thought about her own family, about the Middletons who had always been her safe harbor. She thought about how her mother had taught her to be strong, to stand tall even when the world felt overwhelming. She would need that strength now, not just for herself, but for William, for their children, for everyone who depended on them. She straightened her back slightly, a gesture so subtle that only William would notice. But it spoke volumes about the resolve that was building within her. William noticed the shift and squeezed her hand gently. He knew his wife, knew her courage and her grace. They had been through difficult times before, but something about this moment felt different, more final somehow. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens below where tourists would soon gather, hoping for a glimpse of royal life. How little they knew about what happened behind these walls, he thought. How little anyone could truly understand the weight of living a life that belonged not just to yourself, but to an entire nation. The clock struck 8, and they both knew their private time was coming to an end. Soon the staff would need to be informed, statements would need to be prepared, and the carefully choreographed dance of public life would begin again. But for now, for these last few precious minutes, they remained in their bubble of quiet understanding. Kate stood and walked to William, wrapping her arms around him from behind, her cheek pressed against his back. She could feel his heartbeat, steady despite everything, and she took comfort in that rhythm. They had built a life together against all odds, creating a family and a partnership that had weathered every storm. This would be no different, Kate told herself, even as a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts. William turned in her embrace, cupping her face in his hands and looking into her eyes with such intensity that she felt tears begin to form. He brushed them away gently with his thumbs, then pulled her close, and they stood there in the growing morning light, holding each other as if they could somehow stop time itself. The sound of small footsteps in the hallway reminded them that they were not alone in this, that they had 3 beautiful children who would need them to be strong, to be present, to be the parents they had always strived to be. Kate pulled away gently, wiping her eyes and straightening her shoulders once more. William nodded, understanding what needed to happen next. Together they would face their children, and together they would face whatever came after. But first, they took one last moment to look at each other, to really see each other, to remember why they had chosen this life and this love, despite all its complications. The breakfast room felt unusually quiet as the family gathered around the table. George sat in his usual spot, pushing his scrambled eggs around his plate with a fork, while Charlotte hummed a tune she had learned at school the previous week. Louis, still in his pajamas, was more interested in his toy car than the food in front of him. Kate watched her children with a bittersweet smile, knowing that this ordinary morning would be one of the last before everything changed. William entered the room, having changed into casual clothes, trying his best to appear normal despite the turmoil inside. He ruffled George's hair affectionately and kissed Charlotte on the forehead before sitting down. The nanny had been given the morning off, a rare occurrence that the children seemed to notice. George, ever observant like his father, looked between his parents with questioning eyes. He was old enough now to sense when something was different, when the atmosphere carried an unspoken weight. Kate served herself some tea, her hands steadier now than they had been earlier. She had made a decision during those quiet moments in their private room. She would be strong. She would be the rock that her family needed, no matter how much her own heart was breaking. She caught William's eye across the table, and in that glance, they communicated what they had perfected over years of marriage, a silent understanding, a shared resolve, a partnership that went beyond words. After breakfast, William suggested a walk in the private gardens. The children jumped at the opportunity, always eager for time outside. They bundled up in their coats and boots, Charlotte insisting on her favorite pink wellies despite the dry weather. As they walked along the manicured paths past the rose bushes and the ancient trees, William and Kate held hands while the children ran ahead, their laughter echoing off the palace walls. This garden had been their sanctuary many times before. It was here that William had proposed all those years ago, here that they had played with their children away from prying eyes, here that they had stolen moments of normalcy in their extraordinary lives. Kate looked around, trying to memorize every detail. Wow. The way the light filtered through the leaves, the sound of birds singing in the branches, the feeling of William's hand in hers, warm and familiar. George called out, asking his father to come see something he had found. William jogged ahead, leaving Kate standing on the path. She watched her husband kneel down beside their son, pointing at whatever small creature or interesting stone had captured George's attention. Her heart swelled with love and pride. William was such a devoted father, always making time despite the endless demands on his schedule. She thought about how much their children would miss these simple moments. Charlotte ran back to her mother, her cheeks flushed with excitement, holding a small flower she had picked. Kate accepted it gratefully, tucking it behind her ear, which made Charlotte giggle with delight. These pure, uncomplicated moments of joy were what Kate treasured most. No matter what titles they held or what duties they performed, they were first and foremost a family. That truth anchored her when everything else felt uncertain. They spent nearly an hour in the gardens, the children playing while William and Kate sat on a bench, watching. They talked in low voices about the logistics of what was to come. There would be a formal announcement, carefully worded to respect everyone's privacy while acknowledging the situation. There would be a brief period of public engagements that would need to be fulfilled. And then the goodbye itself, all private, yet somehow destined to become public in the way that everything about their lives eventually did. Kate's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was her mother calling to check in. She excused herself and walked a few steps away to take the call. Her mother's voice, warm and concerned, brought fresh tears to Kate's eyes. She explained the situation as simply as she could. Hearing her mother's sharp intake of breath, her immediate offers of support and love, Kate thanked her, promising to call again soon, and ended the conversation feeling both comforted and more emotional than before. When she returned to the bench, William was playing with Louis, lifting him high in the air and making airplane noises that sent the toddler into fits of giggles. Kate watched them, these males in her life who meant everything to her. She thought about the sacrifices they had all made for this life of service, the privacy they had given up, the scrutiny they endured, and yet looking at them now she saw only love and happiness, and it strengthened her resolve. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. There were staff meetings that couldn't be postponed, calls that needed to be made, and preparations that had to be finalized. Kate changed into more formal attire, transforming from mother into duchess, a role she had learned to navigate with grace and dignity. She sat through meetings nodding at the appropriate times, asking questions when needed, but her mind was partly elsewhere, still in that garden with her family. William was in his own set of meetings, consulting with advisors and family members, making decisions that would affect not just his immediate family, but the institution he represented. The weight of his position had never felt heavier. He longed to be back in the garden, playing with his children, holding his wife's hand, living in the simplicity of just being together. But duty called, as it always did, as it always would. As evening approached, they found themselves back in their private quarters. The children were with their nanny, having their baths and getting ready for bed. Kate stood in front of her wardrobe, looking at the array of clothes, each one carefully chosen for various public appearances. She ran her hand along the fabrics, remembering the events where she had worn each outfit, the people she had met, the causes she had championed. This life had given her a platform to make a real difference, and she was grateful for that even now. William came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood there together, reflected in the mirror, looking at their own faces as if seeing them for the first time. They had aged together, grown together, built a life together. The lines around their eyes told stories of laughter and tears, of sleepless nights with newborns and early mornings with energetic toddlers, of state dinners and private family moments. That night, after they had tucked in the children and read bedtime stories, William and Kate sat in their living room with a simple dinner they had asked the kitchen to prepare. Nothing fancy, just comfort food that reminded them of simpler times. They talked about everything and nothing, avoiding the heavy topics that loomed over them. Instead, choosing to reminisce about happy memories and dream about the future, whatever it might hold. Kate noticed William looking at their wedding photograph on the mantelpiece. She walked over and picked it up, studying the young faces staring back at them. They had been so full of hope and dreams that day, ready to take on the world together. In many ways, she felt they had succeeded beyond what they could have imagined. But in other ways, the cost of that success was only now becoming clear. She set the photo down gently and returned to the sofa, curling up next to William, both of them seeking comfort in each other's presence as the evening deepened into night. The morning of the announcement arrived too quickly. Kate woke before dawn, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake William, and walked to the window. The city was still dark, with only a few lights twinkling in the distance. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, closing her eyes and taking deep breaths, trying to center herself for what lay ahead. She thought about all the times she had faced difficult moments in the public eye. The first time she had walked into a room full of photographers, the nerve-wracking speeches, the constant awareness of being watched and judged. She had learned to handle it all with composure. But this was different. This wasn't about appearances or protocol. This was about something deeply personal that would soon be shared with millions of people who felt they had a right to know every detail of their lives. William stirred and reached for her, finding her side of the bed empty. He sat up, looking around until he spotted her silhouette at the window. Without a word, he got up and joined her, wrapping a blanket around both of their shoulders. Kanekeo stood together in the pre-dawn darkness, finding strength in their silent companionship. No words were needed. They had always been able to communicate in these quiet moments, understanding each other's thoughts and feelings without explanation. The staff arrived early to help them prepare for the day. Kate's stylist helped her choose an outfit that was dignified yet approachable, something that would strike the right tone for such a sensitive announcement. She selected a simple navy dress with a modest neckline, paired with the pearl earrings that had belonged to Diana. She touched them gently, thinking about the woman she had never met, but whose presence was always felt, especially in moments like these. William dressed in a suit, his movements mechanical as he went through the familiar routine. He caught sight of himself in the mirror and paused, straightening his tie and taking a deep breath. He thought about his mother, about the times she had faced the public during her own difficult moments, and he drew inspiration from her courage. He hoped he could face this with even a fraction of her grace. The children sensed that something important was happening. They were unusually quiet at breakfast, picking at their food and watching their parents with wide eyes. Kate tried to maintain a cheerful demeanor, asking about their plans for the day with their nanny, discussing the stories they would read and the games they would play. George, however, was not easily distracted. He asked directly why everyone seemed so serious, why his parents were dressed so formally on what should have been a regular day. William knelt down beside his eldest son, taking his small hands in his larger ones. He explained in age-appropriate terms that sometimes grown-ups had to make difficult decisions and that changes were coming for their family. He emphasized that no matter what happened, they were loved beyond measure, and that love would never change. George nodded slowly, processing the information with a maturity that belied his young years. Charlotte, not fully understanding but sensing the gravity of the moment, hugged her mother tightly, not wanting to let go. The car arrived to take them to the location where the announcement would be made. It was to be a controlled environment, with a small group of trusted journalists and a camera crew that had been carefully vetted. Kate sat in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, practicing the breathing techniques she had learned over the years to manage anxiety. William sat beside her, his jaw set in that determined way that she recognized from their most challenging moments. They arrived at the venue, a historic building that had hosted countless royal announcements over the centuries. The weight of history pressed down on them as they walked through the corridors, past portraits of ancestors who had faced their own trials and tribulations. Kate wondered what they would think of this moment, whether they would understand the choices being made, the reasons behind them. The room where they would make the announcement was smaller than Kate had expected. Chairs were arranged in neat rows and bright lights were being adjusted by technicians. The air smelled of old wood and fresh flowers, an odd combination that Kate found somehow comforting. She and William were shown to a private room where they could wait until it was time. They sat on an uncomfortable sofa, holding hands, each lost in their own thoughts. Kate's mind drifted to the future. She wondered how life would look in the coming months and years. Would they find a new normal? Would the public eventually move on to other stories, other dramas? She hoped so, for the sake of their children, if nothing else. She wanted them to grow up with as much normalcy as possible, despite the extraordinary circumstances of their birth. An aide knocked softly on the door, informing them it was time. William stood first, offering his hand to Kate. She took it, rising gracefully despite the trembling she felt inside. They looked at each other one more time, a long, meaningful look that spoke of partnership, love, and unwavering support. Then they walked out together, their public faces firmly in place, ready to face the cameras and the questions and the judgment that would inevitably follow. The announcement was brief but heartfelt. William spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion Kate knew he was feeling. He chose his words carefully, explaining the situation with honesty while still maintaining the privacy that was necessary. He spoke of duty and family, of difficult decisions made with careful consideration, of gratitude for understanding and support. Kate sat beside him, her face a mask of serene composure, nodding at appropriate moments, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When it was her turn to speak, Kate's voice was soft but clear. She thanked everyone for their continued support of their family and the work they did. She spoke about the importance of privacy during difficult times, while acknowledging the public's interest and concern. She looked directly into the camera, and for a moment she imagined she was speaking to each person individually, asking them to understand, to respect the boundaries they were trying to maintain. The questions from the journalists were respectful but probing. William and Kate answered what they could, deflecting others with practiced diplomacy. They had prepared for this, rehearsing potential questions and answers, but nothing could truly prepare them for the reality of sitting there, exposed and vulnerable, sharing their pain with the world. Kate felt a tear threatening to fall but blinked it away, determined to maintain her composure until they were safely away from the cameras. Finally, it was over. They thanked the journalists and left the room, their aide leading them through a back corridor to avoid the gathering crowds outside. In the car on the way back to the palace, Kate finally let the tears come. William pulled her close, his own eyes wet, and they cried together, releasing the tension and emotion they had been holding back. The driver, discreet and loyal, raised the privacy screen, giving them the space they needed. When they arrived back at Kensington Palace, the children were waiting with their nanny. The moment Kate saw their faces, she composed herself, wiping away her tears and putting on a brave smile. George ran to her, and she scooped him up despite his growing size, holding him tight. Charlotte and Louis followed, and soon the family was in a group embrace, finding comfort in their togetherness. William joined them, his long arms wrapping around all of them, creating a circle of love and protection against the world outside. The days following the announcement were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Messages poured in from around the world, letters and emails expressing support, sympathy, and sometimes criticism. Kate tried not to read too many of them, knowing that she needed to protect her mental health during this difficult time. But some letters touched her deeply, particularly those from people who had faced similar challenges in their own lives and wanted to share their experiences. One letter in particular stayed with Kate. It was from a woman in Yorkshire who had gone through something remarkably similar. She wrote about the pain of saying goodbye, but also about the strength she had found on the other side, the new life she had built, the peace she had eventually discovered. Kate read the letter 3 times, folding it carefully and keeping it in her desk drawer. She would take it out on difficult days, reminding herself that others had walked this path and survived. William threw himself into work, perhaps as a way of coping with the emotional turmoil. He had meetings scheduled back-to-back, visits to charities and organizations, speeches to give. Kate watched him with concern, knowing that he was pushing himself too hard but understanding his need to stay busy. They were handling this crisis in different ways, and she had to trust that he knew what he needed to do to get through it. The children were adjusting in their own ways. George became quieter, more introspective, often found reading in his room or sitting by the window lost in thought. Charlotte dealt with her feelings through art, creating painting after painting, splashing colors across paper with an intensity that spoke of emotions she couldn't yet verbalize. Louis, still so young, seemed less affected, but Kate noticed he clung to her more than usual, wanting to be held and reassured more frequently. Kate made sure to spend quality time with each child individually. She took George to the Science Museum, just the 2 of them, and answered his surprisingly deep questions about life and change. She sat with Charlotte for hours, painting together, letting her daughter express herself without judgment. She played endless games of peekaboo with Louis, making him laugh until his whole body shook, creating moments of pure joy amidst the sadness. One evening, Kate's sister Pippa came to visit. They sat in the private sitting room, just the 2 of them, with tea and biscuits that reminded them of their childhood. Pippa listened as Kate poured out her heart, sharing fears and doubts that she couldn't express to anyone else. Having her sister there, someone who had known her before the titles and the fame, was incredibly comforting. Pippa didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. She just listened, held Kate's hand, and reminded her of her strength. William's brother also visited, and the 2 men spent time together, talking about things only they could understand. They had grown up in this world of duty and expectation, and while their relationship had had its challenges, they shared a bond forged by unique experiences. William came back from their meeting looking lighter somehow, as if a burden had been shared and therefore lessened. The palace gardens continued to be a refuge for the family. They would walk there most evenings, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about mundane things like what to have for dinner or which book to read next. Nature had a way of putting things in perspective. The trees had stood for centuries, weathering storms and seasons, and would continue standing long after they were gone. There was comfort in that permanence, in being part of something larger than their individual struggles. Kate began writing in a journal, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. She found that putting her thoughts and feelings on paper helped her process what was happening. She wrote about her love for William, about her hopes for their children, about the life they had built together. She wrote about her fears too, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, the worry about whether they were making the right decisions. The journal became a safe space where she could be completely honest, without the need to maintain the brave face she showed the world. There were moments of lightness too, brief respites from the heaviness. Louis said something hilariously funny at dinner one night, and the whole family erupted in laughter. They played board games on rainy afternoons, with Charlotte insisting on making up her own rules as they went along. George showed them a magic trick he had learned, performing it with such earnest concentration that Kate felt her heart might burst with love. These moments were precious reminders of what truly mattered. William and Kate made sure to have time alone together too. They would sit in their private room after the children were asleep, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. They reminisced about their courtship, the trips they had taken, the friends they had made. They talked about their wedding day, how nervous they had both been, how magical it had felt to make those promises to each other. They discussed their children's births, the overwhelming love they had felt, the terrifying responsibility. One night, William pulled out a box of old photographs. They spent hours going through them, laughing at younger versions of themselves, marveling at how much had changed. There were photos from university, from holidays with friends, from official engagements and private family moments. Each picture told a story, and together they formed the narrative of their lives. Kate was grateful for these tangible memories, proof that their love and their life together had been real and meaningful. As the day of the actual goodbye approached, Kate found herself alternating between numbness and overwhelming emotion. Sometimes she felt like she was watching herself from outside her body, going through the motions of daily life without really being present. Other times she felt everything so intensely that it was almost too much to bear. She would find herself crying at unexpected moments, triggered by a song on the radio or a familiar scent. The staff at the palace were incredibly supportive, giving the family space when needed but always ready to help. The housekeeper left Kate's favorite flowers in her room every day. The children's nanny was patient and understanding, adapting activities based on how each child was feeling. The security team was extra vigilant, protecting not just their physical safety but also their privacy during this vulnerable time. Kate's parents came to stay for a few days, their presence a source of comfort and stability. Her father took William for long walks, the two men talking about life and responsibility and finding balance. Her mother helped with the children, giving Kate time to rest and take care of herself. There were family dinners where they all squeezed around the table, sharing meals and conversation, creating new memories even as they prepared to say goodbye to others. William surprised Kate one evening with a private dinner he had arranged. Just the two of them, in a small dining room with candles and soft music. They dressed up, she in a beautiful dress, he in a suit, and for a few hours they pretended they were just a normal couple on a date. They talked about silly things, made each other laugh, held hands across the table. It was exactly what Kate needed. A reminder that beneath all the titles and responsibilities, they were simply two people who loved each other deeply. The final week arrived with an inevitability that Kate had been dreading. Each day felt both too long and too short, time moving in strange ways as they counted down to the moment that would change everything. She woke each morning with a heavy feeling in her chest, a physical manifestation of the emotional weight she carried. William was beside her always, his presence a constant source of strength even as she knew he was struggling just as much. They had made the decision together to tell the children more details about what was happening. It felt important that George, Charlotte, and even Louis understood as much as they were able, rather than being confused by events they didn't comprehend. They gathered in the family room, a space that had always been associated with warmth and togetherness, and sat down with their children for one of the most difficult conversations of their lives. George listened intently, his young face serious as he tried to understand. He asked questions that were wise beyond his years, showing a maturity that both impressed and saddened Kate. He wanted to know why, wanted to understand the reasons behind the decision. William answered as honestly as he could, explaining in terms an 8-year-old could grasp while not overwhelming him with details he wasn't ready for. George nodded slowly, processing the information, and then asked the question that broke Kate's heart. Would they still be a family? Kate pulled him onto her lap, something she hadn't done in a while because he was getting so big, and held him close. She assured him that yes, always they would be a family. Nothing could ever change that. The love they had for each other transcended circumstances and geography and whatever challenges they faced. Family wasn't just about living in the same house or seeing each other every day. It was about the bonds they had forged, the memories they had created, the unconditional love they shared. George buried his face in her shoulder, and she felt his small body shake with silent tears. Charlotte didn't fully grasp all the implications, but she understood that something sad was happening. She became clingy, not wanting to leave Kate's side, insisting on sleeping in her parents' room at night. Kate didn't have the heart to say no, so their big bed became a family nest, with children snuggled between them, seeking comfort and reassurance. William would lie awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep, listening to the breathing of his family, memorizing the sound, storing it in his heart. There were practical matters to attend to as well. Legal documents to sign, arrangements to be made, belongings to be sorted through. Kate found herself making decisions about objects that carried memories, deciding what to keep, what to give away, what to store for the future. Each item told a story. A vase from their wedding, a photograph from a state visit, a child's drawing stuck to the refrigerator. She handled each one carefully, honoring the memories while trying not to get overwhelmed by them. Friends came to visit, those precious few who knew them as William and Kate rather than as titles and positions. They brought normalcy, laughter, and distraction. They reminisced about old times, told jokes, played with the children, and provided the emotional support that only true friends could offer. One friend brought photographs from their university days, and they spent an afternoon laughing at their younger selves, at the fashion choices and hairstyles, at how innocent and hopeful they had been. Kate made a point of visiting the charities and causes that had become important to her over the years. She wanted to ensure that the work would continue, that the people she had worked with knew how much they meant to her. At a children's hospice, she spent time with families facing their own goodbyes, finding perspective in their courage and grace. A young mother whose child was terminally ill took Kate's hand and told her that goodbyes were never easy, but that love persisted beyond them. Kate carried those words with her, finding comfort in their truth. William had his own farewell visits to make, duties to fulfill, people to thank. He met with military personnel, with charity workers, with staff members who had served his family for years. Each goodbye was difficult in its own way, each one a small tear in the fabric of the life he had known. But he bore it all with dignity, shaking hands, expressing gratitude, maintaining the composure that had been drilled into him since childhood. The palace staff organized a small gathering in their honor. It was an intimate affair, held in one of the private rooms, with people who had worked with them closely over the years. Speeches were made, some humorous, some touching, all heartfelt. Kate was moved by the genuine affection these people showed, the way they had become like an extended family. She realized that leaving wasn't just about leaving a place or a role, but about leaving people who had become woven into the fabric of their daily lives. On the evening before the goodbye, Kate went through the children's rooms, tucking away toys and organizing clothes. She found herself pausing often, picking up a stuffed animal that George had loved as a toddler, a dress that Charlotte had insisted on wearing every day for a month, a rattle that Louis had recently outgrown. Each item held memories that flooded back, making her smile through her tears. She was grateful for every moment they had shared in these rooms, every bedtime story, every nightmare comforted, every giggle and whisper and secret shared. William found her there, sitting on George's bed holding a small wooden train that his son treasured. He sat down beside her and they looked around the room together. The walls were decorated with drawings and certificates, evidence of a happy childhood, of parents who cared and celebrated every small achievement. They talked about their hopes for their children's futures, about the values they wanted to instill, about the legacy they hoped to leave beyond titles and positions. That night, neither of them could sleep. They lay in bed holding each other, talking in whispers so as not to wake the children who had climbed in with them. They made promises to each other, reaffirming their commitment, their love, their partnership. They talked about the practical aspects of what would come next, but also about their fears and hopes. William stroked Kate's hair, and she traced patterns on his chest, these small, intimate gestures that had become their language over the years. As dawn broke on what would be the day of their goodbye, Kate got up and went to the window one last time. She watched the sun rise over London, the city waking up to a new day, oblivious to the personal drama playing out within the palace walls. She thought about all the people out there, living their own lives, facing their own challenges and joys. She felt connected to them in that moment, understanding that everyone, regardless of their position or circumstances, dealt with love and loss, joy and pain. William joined her at the window, wrapping a blanket around both of them. They stood there as the sky changed from pink to blue, watching the world wake up. They didn't speak, didn't need to. They had always been able to communicate in silence, and this morning was no different. They drew strength from each other, preparing themselves mentally and emotionally for what lay ahead. The day of their private goodbye had arrived, and they would face it together, as they had faced everything else, with love, dignity, and an unbreakable bond. The morning light filtered through the curtains as the family gathered for breakfast one last time, in their familiar dining room. Kate had asked the kitchen to prepare everyone's favorites, wanting this final meal together to be special. George methodically ate his toast, his movements slow and deliberate. Charlotte pushed her food around her plate, her usual cheerful chatter replaced by an unusual quietness. Louis, sensing the somber mood but not fully understanding it, looked between his family members with confused eyes. William cleared his throat and spoke softly, reminding the children of the plan for the day. There would be a private moment, just the family, before the more formal goodbye later. He wanted them to understand that no matter what happened in the coming hours, their love for each other would remain unchanged and unchangeable. Kate reached across the table and squeezed his hand, grateful for his steady presence, his calm words that helped anchor them all. After breakfast, they retreated to the private sitting room where they had spent so many happy hours together. Kate had brought the photo albums, and they sat together on the floor, all 5 of them, flipping through pages of memories. There were pictures from holidays, from birthdays, from quiet Sunday mornings just like this one. George pointed out moments he remembered, telling stories that made them all laugh. Charlotte insisted on finding every photo where she was wearing her favorite princess dress. Louis clapped his hands at pictures of himself as a baby, delighted by his younger self. Kate captured this moment in her mind, knowing she would need to return to it many times in the future. The way the morning light created patterns on the carpet, the sound of her children's voices, the warmth of William's arm around her shoulders, the smell of flowers from the garden wafting through the open window. She wanted to remember everything, every detail, every sensation. This was what mattered most. Not the titles or the palaces or the public attention, but these 5 people in this room, loving each other. William suggested they each share their favorite memory of their time together as a family. George talked about the holiday they had taken to Scotland, where he had learned to fish and they had stayed in a cottage away from everything. Charlotte remembered the day they had gone to the beach and built the biggest sandcastle she had ever seen. Louis, when it was his turn, simply said "Mummy" and "Daddy," which made everyone's eyes fill with tears. William talked about the day George was born, how he had felt his whole world shift in that moment. Kate spoke about mornings just like this one, when they were all together. Those ordinary moments that were actually extraordinary. The children's nanny arrived to take them for their scheduled activities. giving William and Kate time alone for their private goodbye. The children clung to their parents, not wanting to leave, somehow knowing that this departure was different from others. Kate knelt down, embracing each child, breathing in their scent, feeling their small arms around her neck. She whispered words of love and reassurance, promises that she would always be there for them, always love them, no matter what. George was the last to leave. He looked at his mother with eyes that seemed too old for his young face and asked her to promise that they would be okay. Kate cupped his face in her hands, looking directly into his eyes, and promised. She told him he was brave and strong and that she was so proud of him. William embraced his son, holding him for a long moment before gently releasing him to the nanny's care. They watched as their children left the room, 3 small figures walking away, and it took everything Kate had not to run after them. Alone now, William and Kate stood in the center of the room, facing each other. All the words they had planned to say seemed inadequate now. How could they sum up years of love, partnership, and shared dreams in a single conversation? How could they say goodbye to the life they had built together? Kate stepped forward and William enfolded her in his arms. And they stood there, holding each other, crying freely now that there was no need to be strong for anyone else. They talked about the future, about how they would navigate the changes ahead, about how they would co-parent and maintain the family unit despite the circumstances. They made practical plans and emotional promises. William promised to always be there for the children, to never let them doubt his love. Kate promised the same, and also promised to take care of herself, to not lose herself in the sadness. They promised to remember this love, to honor what they had built together even as they moved forward separately. Kate walked to the window one more time, looking out at the gardens they had loved so much. She remembered the first time William had brought her here, how overwhelmed she had felt by the grandeur and history. She remembered how he had taken her hand and told her they would navigate this life together, that she would never be alone. He had kept that promise through everything, and she was grateful for every moment they had shared. William joined her at the window, and they stood side by side, looking out at the same view they had gazed upon countless times before. He pointed out the tree where they had watched George take his first steps, the bench where they had sat during Kate's pregnancies, the path where they had walked through both joy and sorrow. Every inch of this place held memories, and Kate knew she would carry them with her, wherever she went. The time came for the more formal goodbye, the one that would be witnessed and recorded, the one that would become part of public record. They composed themselves, wiping away tears, straightening clothes, putting on the masks of dignity and grace that they had worn for so long. Kate looked at herself in the mirror, seeing not the Duchess but the woman beneath, the girl from Berkshire who had fallen in love with a prince and tried her best to navigate an impossible role. The formal goodbye was brief but profound. In front of a small group of officials and a single camera that would record the moment for history, William and Kate stood together one last time in their official capacity. They spoke words that had been carefully chosen, expressing gratitude for the years they had shared, respect for each other and the institutions they represented, and hope for the future. Their voices remained steady, but those who knew them well could hear the emotion beneath the composed exteriors. When it was over, they had one last private moment before parting ways. In a small room away from everyone else, they held each other one final time. No words were spoken now. Everything had been said. They simply stood there, memorizing the feel of each other, the sound of each other's breathing, the beating of each other's hearts. Kate rested her head on William's chest, listening to his heartbeat, that sound that had comforted her through so many nights. William kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, storing the memory for the difficult days ahead. Finally, reluctantly, they pulled apart. They looked at each other, really looked, seeing past the titles and the roles to the people they truly were. Kate saw the boy she had fallen in love with at university, the man who had proposed to her with such nervous excitement, the father who loved their children with every fiber of his being. William saw the woman who had chosen him despite everything, who had faced the challenges of royal life with grace and courage, who had given him a family and a love he had never thought possible. They walked out of the room together, knowing that when they reached the end of the corridor, they would part and go their separate ways. Each step felt heavy, final. Kate's hand was in William's, their fingers interlaced one last time. They reached the point where they would separate, and they paused, looking at each other one more time. William raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Kate touched his face, her fingers tracing the features she knew so well. And then, with strength they didn't know they possessed, they let go. Kate walked away without looking back, though every instinct screamed at her to turn around. She heard William's footsteps going in the opposite direction, growing fainter until finally there was silence. She made it to her car, maintaining her composure until the door closed and the privacy screen went up. Only then did she allow herself to break down completely, sobbing with a grief that felt like it might consume her. The world outside continued as normal, people going about their daily lives, unaware of the personal tragedy that had just unfolded behind palace walls. But for those who had witnessed it, for the staff who had served them, for the family members who loved them, this day would be remembered as one of profound sadness and incredible dignity. William and Kate had faced their private goodbye with the same grace and courage they had shown throughout their public lives, proving that some loves, even when they end, remain beautiful in their memory. As Kate's car drove away from Kensington Palace, she looked back one last time through the rear window. The building stood majestic and unchanged, holding within its walls years of memories, laughter, tears, and love. She placed her hand on the window, a final goodbye to the life she had known, the woman she had been, the love that had defined her. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the grounds, and Kate understood that while this chapter was closing, she would carry its lessons and its love with her forever. The goodbye had been said, the tears had been shed, but the love that would remain eternal, untouched by time or distance or circumstance. That love,